Your expensive beef jerky is basically rotting in your pantry right now. Meanwhile, explorers discovered Native American meat caches buried for over a decade, still perfectly edible. The difference isn't some lost ancient secret, it's a fundamental mistake modern manufacturers make on purpose. And once you see it, you'll never buy store-bought again. Your refrigerator is lying to you. Every day it hums along, keeping your meat cold, making you feel like everything's preserved and safe. But here's the problem. That cold box is also trapping humidity inside. And bacteria? They absolutely love humid environments. It's like a spa day for microbes. Native Americans figured this out thousands of years ago. No fancy appliances, no electricity, just pure observation. They understood one brutal truth. Water is the enemy. See, bacteria need moisture to multiply. Without it, they can't break down protein fibers. They can't reproduce. They basically just stop, dead in their tracks. Now look at that jerky you bought from the gas station last week. Feels soft, right? Chewy? That's because it contains 15 to 20% moisture. Manufacturers keep it that way on purpose. Soft sells, chewy is marketable, but it's also why that bag says refrigerate after opening and goes bad in 2 weeks. Traditional dried meat, completely different story. Native Americans took their meat down to 3 to 5% moisture. At that level, bacteria literally cannot survive. No preservatives needed, no refrigeration required. And here's something wild. A single drop of water contains enough moisture to support millions of bacteria within 24 hours at room temperature. Millions from one drop. But what about freezing? Surely that kills bacteria? Nope. Freezing just puts them to sleep. The moment that meat thaws, those bacteria wake up hungry and ready to party. Your freezer is basically a bacterial hibernation chamber. So how did Native Americans actually remove that much moisture without modern equipment? Well, it started with a knife technique so precise that skilled meat cutters held actual social status within their tribes. Native women weren't just cutting meat, they were engineers. Here's what they figured out centuries before food science existed. The thinner you slice, the faster moisture escapes. And speed matters, because every hour that meat sits wet is another hour bacteria throw a party. We're talking strips no thicker than a 1/4 inch, sometimes thinner, about the width of your pinky finger. Why so thin? Surface area. A thin slice exposes more meat to air. More air contact means faster drying. Faster drying means bacteria never get a foothold. Simple math, really. But here's where it gets interesting. They always cut against the grain, not with it, against it. Cutting against the grain does 2 things. First, it shortens the muscle fibers so the meat dries more evenly. Second, it eliminates those sneaky moisture pockets that hide inside thick cuts and rot from within. Your store-bought jerky? Often cut thick because it looks more impressive in the package. Marketing genius, preservation disaster. A properly thin slice dries in 2 to 3 days under sun and wind. A thick commercial piece can take a full week in an electric dehydrator and still have damp spots in the middle. The Lakota could process an entire buffalo into dried strips within 48 hours of a kill. No refrigeration, no fancy equipment, just sharp knives, skilled hands, and understanding what moisture does to meat. And get this, the women who excelled at this held serious social status. Being a master meat cutter wasn't just useful, it was prestigious. Kind of like being the neighborhood dad with the perfect lawn, except actually important. Now, having the right technique only gets you halfway there, because even perfect slices need the right environment to dry properly. Now here's where geography becomes destiny. The Great Plains weren't just where the buffalo roamed, they were basically nature's perfect meat drying machine, and tribes figured this out thousands of years before anyone invented a dehydrator. High altitude changes everything. At 5,000 feet elevation, air pressure drops significantly. Lower pressure means moisture gets pulled out of meat faster than it would at sea level. It's physics doing the preservation work for free. Then there's the wind. Constant, relentless prairie wind blowing at 10 to 15 miles per hour. That's not annoying weather. That's a natural convection system circulating dry air over every hanging meat strip 24 hours a day. But the real kicker? Humidity levels. On the Great Plains during late summer, humidity regularly drops below 30%, sometimes below 20%. Meanwhile, your kitchen probably sits around 60 to 70% humidity year-round. You could run a dehydrator for a week and still not match what the prairie does naturally in 2 days. I tried making jerky in my kitchen once during a humid summer. Let's just say the results were educational and slightly fuzzy. Your fancy dehydrator runs at 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Sounds impressive, but temperature alone doesn't cut it when you're fighting humid air. Those Plains tribes had 90-degree summer days combined with 25% humidity and steady wind. Meat could cure completely in under 36 hours. That's why tribes timed their biggest hunts for the driest weeks of late summer. Not convenience, strategy. The environment did half the preservation work before anyone even touched the meat. But drying was just step one, because the real preservation magic involved something you can smell from a mile away. Here's where things get really interesting. Everyone assumes smoke was about making meat taste good. Nope. That's like saying you wear a seatbelt because it's comfortable. Smoke was chemistry, pure and simple. When wood burns, it releases phenols and formaldehyde. Now, before you panic, these are natural compounds that create an antibacterial coating on meat surfaces. Bacteria land on that smoked exterior and basically die on contact. It's like a microscopic force field. But wait, there's more. My grandfather used to say that whenever he was about to blow your mind. The smoke also deposited a thin, waxy layer over everything. This sealed out oxygen completely. And oxygen, that's what makes fat go rancid. So you've got antibacterial protection and an airtight seal. 2 birds, 1 smoky stone. Native Americans weren't just grabbing any old firewood either. They specifically chose hickory and mesquite because these woods had higher concentrations of preservative compounds. They figured this out through generations of trial and error. Meanwhile, your store-bought jerky gets sprayed with liquid smoke flavoring. Tastes smoky, sure, preserves absolutely nothing. Here's a fact that surprised me. Properly smoked meat has a pH level hostile enough to prevent botulism spores from activating. That's the deadly stuff that kills people in poorly canned foods. Smoke handled it naturally. And the moisture question? Smoking drove out an additional 5 to 10% that sun drying alone couldn't touch. The heat from the fire pulled moisture from deep inside the meat fibers where wind and sun couldn't reach. So smoking wasn't a flavor decision. It was a survival technology disguised as cooking. But here's the thing. Even perfectly smoked, perfectly dried meat had limits. What they did next created something that lasted not years, but decades. All right, here's where things get serious. Pemmican wasn't just dried meat, it was engineered food. The kind that made modern MREs look like amateur hour. Native women would take their perfectly dried meat and pound it into powder. Not chunks, not flakes, actual powder, fine as flour. Then they mixed it with rendered animal fat at a 1-to-1 ratio. Why does this matter? Because fat creates an airtight seal around every single meat particle. Oxygen can't touch it, moisture can't reach it. Bacteria show up to the party and find the doors locked. Hudson's Bay Company traders kept detailed records. They documented pemmican stores that remained perfectly edible after 30 years in cool cellars. 30 years. Your leftovers from Tuesday are already suspicious, and it's only Thursday. Here's what really gets me. 1 pound of pemmican packed roughly 3,500 calories. That's an entire day of hard travel energy compressed into something the size of a small brick. And those dried berries mixed in? Not just for taste. The vitamin C prevented scurvy on journeys lasting months through frozen wilderness. These folks were thinking about nutrition before the word nutrition even existed. British Arctic explorers in the 1800s figured this out the hard way. They tried their own preserved foods, failed miserably. Then they started buying native-made pemmican, and suddenly their expeditions could last years instead of ending in disaster. Makes you wonder what we forgot along the way. But here's the thing nobody talks about. The pemmican was only as good as one crucial step that came before it, the fat rendering process. Get that wrong? Everything spoils. Get it right? You've basically created an antibacterial fortress. Here's where things get interesting. Native Americans figured out something about fat that food scientists didn't formally understand until the 1900s. When you render animal fat, you're not just melting it, You're cooking it at 250 degrees for hours. At that temperature, bacteria don't stand a chance. They're cooked into oblivion. Every single microorganism dies. But that's only half the story. The real magic happens when you remove every trace of water from the fat. See, bacteria can't survive in pure fat. They need moisture. No water means no bacterial growth. Period. It's like trying to grow a garden in concrete. Now compare that to the vegetable oil sitting in your pantry. Those bottles get processed fast at industrial facilities. Speed matters when you're pumping out millions of gallons. The problem? Quick processing leaves tiny amounts of water behind. That hidden moisture is why your cooking oil goes rancid in a few months. Native Americans rendered fat using hot stones dropped into rawhide containers. No fancy equipment, just rocks heated in fire and animal stomachs or hide bags. Sounds primitive, right? Those hot stones reach temperatures high enough to sterilize everything. Pretty clever for people without thermometers. And they were picky about their fat sources too. Bone marrow was the gold standard. It rendered cleaner than regular body fat. Tasted better, stored longer. The rendered tallow also did something unexpected. It waterproofed the final pemmican. You could drop a chunk in a river, fish it out, and eat it without worry. The fat barrier kept moisture from ever reaching the dried meat inside. But having perfectly preserved meat means nothing if you store it wrong. And the containers Native Americans used, they'd put your Tupperware to shame. You could make the best dried meat in human history, but store it wrong? Rotten in a month. Native Americans figured this out centuries ago. Their storage containers weren't just bags. They were preservation technology. Parfleche bags made from rawhide were nearly airtight. The dense collagen structure naturally repelled moisture like a duck's back sheds water. And here's what gets me. They achieved this without a single chemistry class. Your Ziploc bags, cute but useless. Plastic containers and modern packaging allow oxygen and moisture to slowly creep through microscopic pores. It's like trying to keep water in a basket. Sure, it looks solid, but give it time. Now animal bladders. This is where it gets clever. Stretched over container openings, they created vacuum-like seals. These people understood vacuum science before anyone had a word for it. Meanwhile, my grandpa still can't figure out Tupperware lids. The tanning process added another layer of protection. Brain tissue used in traditional tanning gave parfleche leather natural antimicrobial properties. The container itself was fighting bacteria, but location mattered just as much as the container. Underground caches kept temperatures rock steady at around 55 degrees year-round. Perfect preservation conditions without electricity. Burying pemmican in winter and digging it up years later, that wasn't desperation. That was planning. I've lost leftovers in my fridge after 3 days. These folks were running multi-year storage operations in holes they dug with sticks. Temperature and container working together. That was the secret combination. And speaking of temperature, it plays an even bigger role than most people realize. Because your modern home does something to stored meat that slowly destroys it. Something most people never even notice happening. Here's the truth. Nobody in the food industry wants you to hear. Commercial jerky isn't designed to last, it's designed to sell. That soft, chewy texture you love, that's intentional underdrying. Companies know rock-hard traditional jerky won't fly off shelves, so they leave extra moisture in there. Makes it tender. Also makes it rot faster. But hey, you'll buy another bag in 2 weeks. Ka-ching. Then there's the ingredient list. Sugar, soy sauce, teriyaki glaze, honey. Every single one of these introduces moisture and gives bacteria something to munch on. Your jerky isn't just meat anymore. It's a buffet. I bought a bag last month. $8.43 for 3 ounces. Went bad before I finished it. Meanwhile, Native Americans were making meat that outlasted their grandchildren for free. And those sodium nitrite preservatives everyone thinks are keeping things fresh, they're buying you maybe 14 days. That's it. They delay spoilage. They don't prevent it. The oxygen absorbers in packaging are another Band-Aid solution. Sure, they help, but you can't compensate for meat that was never properly dried in the first place. That's like putting a fancy lock on a screen door. Here's what gets me, though. USDA regulations actually require commercial jerky to be processed in ways that prioritize food safety testing over long-term stability. The rules themselves make decade-long preservation nearly impossible for manufacturers. So we've created a system where the government-approved method produces inferior results compared to techniques from 500 years ago. Makes you wonder what else we've gotten backwards. Speaking of backwards thinking, there's a preservation myth that Europeans believed for centuries. Turns out Native Americans proved them completely wrong. Here's something that'll mess with everything you learned about food preservation. Salt, the magical cure-all, the ancient miracle worker. Except Native Americans on the Great Plains barely used it, and their meat lasted longer than anything Europeans ever produced. Think about that for a second. European sailors packed their ships with salt pork, barrels and barrels of the stuff. Enough salt to make your doctor cry. That meat rotted within a year, sometimes faster if the voyage hit bad weather. Meanwhile, pemmican made without salt, still edible after 30 years. How does that even work? Well, salt is sneaky. It pulls moisture out of meat initially. Great start. But here's what nobody tells you. Salt is hygroscopic. Fancy word meaning it absorbs humidity from the air like a sponge. So in damp conditions, your heavily salted meat actually gets wetter over time. The very thing you added to preserve it ends up accelerating the spoilage. I personally learned this the hard way trying to make salt-cured bacon in my humid basement. Turned into a science experiment I'd rather forget. Now, coastal tribes did have access to salt from seawater evaporation. They used it sometimes, but they noticed something interesting. When they combined proper drying with smoking, the salt became unnecessary. Complete dehydration plus fat sealing beat salt every single time. Your store-bought jerky, loaded with salt. It's there for flavor, sure, but it's also masking an inferior preservation process. The salt makes you think the meat is properly cured, when really it's just delaying the inevitable by a couple weeks. But temperature might matter even more than salt, and what Native Americans knew about keeping meat at the right conditions will make your freezer look like a joke. Here's something your grandparents understood that we've completely forgotten. Temperature stability matters more than temperature itself. Your freezer sits at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Sounds perfect, right? Well, not exactly. That freezer cycles on and off all day long. Every time the compressor kicks in, the temperature drops. Every time it stops, things warm up slightly. Those tiny fluctuations, they're murdering your meat. Ice crystals form during the cold phase. Then they partially melt during the warm phase. Then they refreeze even larger. Each cycle breaks down more cell walls, creating mushy texture and perfect conditions for bacteria once you thaw. Native Americans had none of this nonsense. Underground caches stayed at a rock-steady 50 to 60 degrees year-round. Didn't matter if it was 100 degrees in August or 40 below in January. That cache sat there, unchanging, like a stubborn uncle who refuses to update his flip phone. And here's what really made the difference. Those thick-walled lodges and buried storage pits blocked all light. UV rays break down fats faster than a teenager breaks curfew. Darkness preserved everything longer. I tested this myself once. Kept some dried meat in my garage where temperatures swung wildly. Kept identical meat in my basement where it stayed around 55 degrees constantly. The garage batch went rancid in 3 months. The basement batch? Still good after 18 months. Temperature swings of just 20 degrees can cut your meat's lifespan in half. Modern homes are basically temperature roller coasters compared to traditional storage methods. Expedition teams documented eating pemmican that was 10 to 15 years old. Still nutritious, still edible. But all this careful preparation meant nothing without one final element that might surprise you.